Hello, and welcome to the Adventures in Arting podcast. My name is Julie Fei-Fan Balzer, and I have been hosting this podcast with my super special co-host and my mom, Eileen Hsu-Balzer, since 2012. Hi, Mom.
Hello, Julie.
So, on this podcast, our goal is to help you develop and maintain a thriving art practice. And an art practice is essentially a framework. And that is exactly what we're going to talk about today. So, this is episode 168, which I am calling Why Artists Need Frameworks. And I think it's something that might actually change the way that you approach your art forever because I know when we say framework that you might be thinking like, oh my gosh, she's trying to pen me in with structure and rules, and that sounds horrible and restrictive and don't block me in. But let me tell you, a framework actually makes you more creative and not less. So I'm sure if you've ever tried to make anything, whether it's write something, like write a book, write a paper, write a blog post, or if you've ever tried to write a song or draw or create something with clay, like you felt stuck, right? Or you've hit a plateau where everything looks the same. You don't feel like you're getting any better. You're just kind of stuck, right? So that's what frameworks are for. They're not rigid rules. They're more like tools and they help you get started, experiment, problem solve, and ultimately evolve, which is our hope as an artist. So, in this episode, we are going to break down what frameworks are, why they work, and how, see that what, why, how, you can use them to improve your art practice today. And then I'll also share some of my own favorite frameworks, like I've talked about the art parts method before on the podcast. The P method is something I talked about on my blog recently, and there are some very well-known ones used by artists for centuries. So, whether you're a seasoned pro or just starting your creative journey, this episode is packed with actionable insights to help you grow. So, let's get into it. So, Mom, now you have actually been a framework person. I'm not sure consciously, but my whole life. Like you've always set up things like if you want to remember to bring things up the stairs, you put them at the bottom of the stairs. That is actually the beginning of a framework. It's a framework for getting things done. And you also have like a 5-minute rule you've always said to me. What are some other frameworks you can think of that you use in your life?
Well, if I don't want to forget to take something out the door with
Yep.
me, I put it in front of the door so I cannot open the door without moving it.
Hmm.
So that would be one of the things. Or it used to be when you were little and we had to get you dressed in the morning for school, we'd go through the picking the clothes and putting them out the night before. I mean, it's like a way of making sure that you can't leave the house without noticing it and doing something about it.
Yeah, and the chances are that you out there listening or watching this podcast also already have frameworks that you use. Essentially, if you
Right.
want to have a habit like going to the gym, you might set up a framework for yourself. I am sure that I have clean clothes and my bag packed and my sneakers by the door at night so that in the
Right.
morning it's very easy for me to go. And I've set up my day in a way in which I have the time to go to the gym, to shower, and to make it to work or whatever my next activity is, et cetera, et cetera. Like you have probably frameworks like this you don't even think about around making dinner or getting tasks done. And so the issue is you can create that framework as an artist as well. So essentially, if I give you an official definition, which I took the time to write down, it would be something like a framework for an artist is a structured approach that helps guide the creative process. It provides a set of principles, steps, or techniques that artists can use to generate ideas, improve skills, refine their work, and overcome creative blocks. So, an example you're probably familiar with is color theory. If you understand color theory, it's not rules that are like, if you mix these two colors, you are going to color jail, right? It's more like, if you mix these two colors, this is the result that you'll probably get. Do you want that? You know, it's more like setting up a situation where you're aware of, I don't call it the rules, but sort of like the what will happen, how you can kind of control things to get the outcome that you want. You know, If you want to have something that's very pleasing, you might consider these, types of palettes that have worked for people for years. If you're looking for something that's a little more jangly, man, hit the paints in a totally different way. And so if we accept that there are these frameworks that exist and have worked, right, we can also accept that they're not rigid rule sets, right? They're flexible tools, they're roadmaps that you can follow, adapt, and of course, break as you need to. It's just about, I think this word gets overused, but I'm going to use it. And it's not even interesting, Mom. The word that I am going to use is clarity. Frameworks really help bring clarity to your artistic process, just making it easier to start, more comfortable to experiment, and just pushing you to evolve. So the thing to keep in mind is that frameworks don't restrict creativity, they support it. Okay.
One of
I
the
think
ways
of
that
it.
I always apply
Mhm,
this, because I'm not an artist, but for example, to cooking, if I want to change a recipe, I have some kind of background of experience where I know certain things can replace certain other things. I might experiment with something I've never done before, or I might learn something from the recipe. But in general, I know that you know, you can replace butter
mhm.
with a lot of other things. But there are certain things that you can't put together without unpleasant results.
Yeah, like great chefs don't just throw things together at random. They have a structure, but then they experiment within that structure. And this is the same as like jazz musicians or anybody else who has a structure and then they play within that structure. And it gives you a certain amount of freedom because it's like you have um kind of like the bumpers for kids at a bowling alley. It's just making sure that you're staying in your lane, but you can see what happens, you know what I mean, if you swing a little left, a little right. Okay, so let's talk about four key assists. This is basically why and how do frameworks help artists. So the first thing is they remove the fear of the blank page. One of the biggest struggles artists face is getting started. The blank canvas, the blank art journal page, the blank anything can feel overwhelming. And in fact, some of my earliest blog posts from like the 2008, 9, 10 era are all about getting over the fear of the blank page. And even the most recent art journaling class I taught, like the first few lessons were all about let's mess up this white journal so that it's less scary, right? And frameworks help because they provide structure, so you're not starting from zero. It can often give you a prompt, a method, or a set of constraints that make starting easier. So instead of thinking, what should I create? You think, how can I apply this framework? So if I tell you what you need to do to start is put down 3 colors of paint and 2 dots. You're not scared anymore of the blank page because it's not that the finished art is 3 colors and 2 dots. It's that that's the starting. So that's all you do on autopilot. 3 colors, 2 dots, and you can play around a little bit of this color, a lot of that color. The dots are big, the dots are small, the dots are together, the dots are far apart. But again, you're helped by this framework. It's almost like having a journal prompt.
Actually,
Yeah.
one of the things you've told me is that sometimes having constraints that you can't use certain kinds of paint, or you need to do something on a small piece of paper or something like that, has helped you be more creative because you've been forced to narrow down your choices and to think maybe in a different way.
Yeah, I think a lot of times, like even when I've had like budget issues where I can't do something I want, and then it turns out that the solution that I came up with is actually better and cheaper. So that's like win-win, or you're trying to do something and you have to find some other way around, and it ends up being so much better than you could have imagined. I think, you
That's
know,
right.
there are so many ways in which we are mad about constraints and it feels like they're stopping us. But if you can pause for a moment and think about how to work within those constraints, and I think this is true in art and in life, it almost always pushes you to something new and exciting. It can be painful, but it can be really, really great. Um, so I was going to say I have a couple different frameworks that I use around my work to sort of get started. And they can be very simple. This is not like you have to write out a 40-page thesis about what this is supposed to be, right? So, for instance, I have a particular workbook that I use. This is something that I taught during the Carve December workbook. And the way that it works, you get to iterate ideas out, and it kind of follows the pattern of your brain. And what I found is when I go through the actual sit down process of writing out my ideas and following, okay, if this idea, arrow over to the new idea, but then that idea actually leads me this way. I find that my ideas are better, that they're stronger, that they're deeper, and that I get to something that's really compelling. See how I didn't use the word interesting? And I get to something that's really compelling much more quickly than I would have been if I just started working instead of going through that ideation process, you know? And I think there are probably other frameworks that people have. I mean, look online, type in brainstorming, and you'll find techniques palooza for how to mind map, how to do this, how to do that, because frameworks are so helpful. So the key takeaway is thinking that frameworks replace uncertainty with a clear starting point. So if you're thinking about developing your own framework, think about how you can create a clear starting point. That could be your gym bag is packed by the door if your thing that you desire to do is go running. But if you want to make more art, perhaps the framework could be that you leave the studio in such a way that starting is easy, you know? Or it could be, if you're afraid of that blank page, that you start by messing it up. All of those things replace that uncertainty with a clear way that you begin. Okay, so number two. So frameworks create a sense of direction. Now, this is where you need a framework to act as a roadmap, guiding your choices and helping you progress step by step, right? This is when you don't know what to do next. I find this a lot. This comes up a lot at my art practice and group coaching. People will say, I don't know if it's done, and I sort of don't know what to do next. Like, I really like it now, and I'm not sure if I should go this way or that way, but I feel like I need something over here, right? And we spend a lot of time talking through whatever it is they're going through. Now, if you have a framework, what happens is it provides a clear focus. What are you trying to achieve? That's one of the first questions I always ask in group coaching, because I might know where I want your piece to go, but it's not my artwork, right? It's your artwork. So I say, what are you happy with? What are you hoping for? Because if you don't know where you're trying to go, I can't help you get there, and you probably can't get there either. There is something to be said for wandering around, but when you get towards that end point of work, you need to think about where you're going. And even if you're in the middle of it, if you were on a road trip, let's put it this way, I always think of the Muppets movie where they come to the fork in the road. And for years and years, I think probably until I was a driver, I literally thought that I would come to a giant, like, silverware fork. If you've never seen the movie Standing Up in the Road, I didn't understand that it just meant that the road diverged into two roads. I thought that there were forks in the road. Anyway, the Muppet movie ruined me. But what I was going to say is, when you come to a fork in the road, you pick a direction. And that is part of what a framework can help with, is helping to push you, giving you a way to decide between A and B. Okay. And a framework really helps to eliminate decision fatigue by narrowing down your choices. If I actually listened to a fantastic podcast from the New Yorker, I'm trying to desperately to remember the name of the podcast. It's Critics at Large. And it is three critics, culture critics. And one of the things they talked about is decision fatigue, and how we are plagued by so many choices in our modern society that we reach a point where there's 2,000 things you can stream, but nothing to watch. Where it is the luxury is to say to someone else, I don't want to choose what we eat tonight. You pick it. That it isn't the labor of doing it that's difficult. It's the labor of choosing it, because there are so many choices. And
Then if I'm your brother,
yeah,
I will say I don't like that. I don't like
yeah,
that choice.
yes, that too. Guess what I want? Nope. Now I'm not happy. And I think like this is sometimes the thing that my husband and I talk about, which is it is so overwhelming to have that many choices that we often try to do this thing where we're like, let's get on a schedule where we just have like Taco Tuesday and whatever it is, Hamburger Wednesday. But then we never stick to it ever, so it doesn't work out. But that's us trying to think about limiting the choices. And I think when you work with like limited supplies, limited colors, or anything like that, that's one of the ways that you help do that, right? Because you have something that you're working towards. So the P method, which I promised to tell you about, is PEE, which is practice, experiment, embrace, right? That's the idea. That's a framework. And so if you're doing it, you start with your first goal. I want to practice something. So let's say the skill you want to practice is using your watercolor paints. So you sort of practice using them. Then the question is, what do you do next? What's the next letter? Experiment. Oh, that means I should try something that I haven't tried before, or I should come up with an idea, a hypothesis, and see what happens, right? Then I sort of don't know what to do because this thing happened. And so the next letter is embrace. And what that really means is instead of being like, ick, I'm done with watercolors, I stink at this, you say, okay, let's embrace whatever happened with my experiment and let that determine how I come back into the cycle. Because again, PEE, the next letter after embrace is practice. So now you're going to practice to get the result that you want from the watercolors. Once you have, then you're free to begin to experiment. Then once you embrace whatever has happened, you're ready to go back into practice. And so it becomes a framework that you can comfortably follow. It means that there are just, not a lot of mistakes because things are happening in the process. You're comfortable with it. It's easy. It's a way to give yourself something to hang on to when things are so very uncertain. And I would say in a more formal way, like the elements and principles of art framework, if you're familiar with that, that gives artists really the step-by-step fundamentals. It's a framework. It doesn't mean that you have to use all the elements and all the principles at all the times, but it is a way of thinking there's something wrong here. What can I do to fix it? Let me go to the list of the principles of art and see if there's something here that can help me. Can I use balance? Can I use emphasis? Can I use, whatever it is and find a way to deal with it? And basically, a framework turns aimless exploration into purposeful progress, right? If you're just scribbling around playing, suddenly, if you have a framework, you feel like you're actually working towards something and not just sort of wandering, which is exciting. Okay, number 3. Frameworks help artists make decisions with confidence. Listen, one of the hardest parts of making art is knowing when something is working and when it isn't. It's why I text my mother photos of things in the middle of the night to say, what do you think? Many artists second guess themselves or feel unsure about what needs improvement. So frameworks give you tools so because you can't text my mother in the middle of the night. Maybe you can text your own mother, maybe not. Maybe you don't want to. But whatever it is, it gives you tools to assess your work with clarity. And I will say something that is important to say, no offense, Mom, I don't always take her opinion as gospel.
Good, because it's not my goal in assessing. It's my goal is to give you a reaction of someone who hasn't been deeply involved in the process upon first seeing something.
Yeah, which I find enormously helpful because I often think, oh, wow, I think this is great. And then I get a kind of meh response. And then I have to think about whether I think it's great because it's improved beyond where it is, or whether it's absolutely great. Or I'll send something and say, not sure where this one's headed, and you'll be very enthusiastic, and I'll have to think about that maybe it's because it hasn't reached my expectation. And can I take a step back and look at it with fresh eyes and see where it is now instead of where I wanted it to be, you know?
And then sometimes You just have to go to bed and sleep on it.
Sometimes you just have to go to bed.
And that's because you've looked at it too long.
Yeah. And so framework, if you have a framework for analyzing your work, right? It can help you analyze your work objectively, so you don't just rely on intuition. The framework can provide guidelines and principles that make decision making easier. For instance, if I tell you the balance in your piece is off, that's not necessarily an opinion. Like I can bring evidence and facts to show you that the balance is off. And then you just have to make the decision about whether you want the balance to be off or you don't want the balance to be off, right? But we can empirically say whether the balance visually is on or off, right?
One of the things I've learned in my response to your artworks that you send me in the middle of the night, works in progress, is I've learned to be very specific about what it is that's bothering me about it. So I don't just say, oh, I don't like this. You know, I've
Yeah.
learned to say there appears to be no focus
Mhm,
to me,
mhm.
and so that you at least know what you're reacting to.
Yeah, and it's also like we have a framework between us, partially because I know what your taste is. I know what kind of art you like, which isn't necessarily my taste, but it helps me understand your reaction. And then I can say, like, oh, this comment, totally, she's right, or I get it and I can see it, or this comment, I'm going to push, out to the side and say, I'm not going to pay attention to that. And I think that's an important skill in general to develop also about yourself. Once you have a framework for understanding like how to critique and how to critique yourself, part of that is also understanding who you are, what you like, what you don't like. What kind of are your crutches that maybe you should push away from? What are the things that always work for you, et cetera, et cetera? What's your color palette?
Just
Anyway,
as a
so
side
yeah,
note, I want to
yeah.
say that I think it's important when you ask people what they think, that you understand the nature of the relationship between you and the other person. So it's not just that they give you useful critique, but also that nobody's feelings are going to be hurt. Nobody's insisting, nobody's asking me to fix it. So I think you have to be careful. And then when you find someone that it works with, keep developing that because it's going to be useful to you.
Yeah, the most useful critique I ever got was from two women who talked about my work, not in opinion, but in fact. And they just said, this is what I see. And they said, I see this, I see that, and that was incredibly useful because I could hear it as fact instead
Hmm.
of as opinion. And then I just had to decide whether I liked those facts about myself. It reminds me a little bit. So, if I may meander down a long rabbit hole conversation for just a moment, and if you can't do that on your own podcast, really, where can you do that? So when I was in my 20s, I used to work for my father. And he taught a course for managers at big corporations all about personal voice, right? And one of the things that he used to talk about, and the metaphor is like, if you're a tuba, you can't play flute music. You'll always sound bad playing flute music if you're a tuba. But if you're a tuba playing tuba music, you can be the best, tubaist, tuba player. Well, I don't know what it
Tubist?
is.
I don't know.
Anyway, tubist. I hope it's tubist. Anyway, but you can be the best tuba player in the world, but you have to play tuba music. And what that means is if you come across as cold, even if you're the kindest, nicest, sweetest person, you have to learn how to behave in a way that a cold person warms up to other people, because that's how people are perceiving you. And so the same thing is true of your artwork to a certain extent, which is if you think your work is meant to bring happiness and light, and people tell you when they look at it that they feel sad or depressed, you need to think about that. What about it is the difference between what makes you happy and what makes other people happy? And are you trying to make the art to make yourself feel happy, or is it important to you that other people feel that way? So I think about that a lot because I like really busy work. I like it in my own work. I like it in other people's work. I love really busy work. I love really intense, like insanely busy work. The number one thing that people tell me all the time is to make my work less busy. And it's something that I ping pong wildly about because on the one hand, I get it and I appreciate work that has air in it. But on the other hand, I also just love insane, intensely patterned things. And so I'm always trying to decide whether I need to add that air to make it more interesting to a wider audience, or whether I'm okay having a very narrow audience, but who is sort of intensely like the same thing that I like, or whether there's a compromise that's somewhere in the middle. But all of this is to say that sort of knowing yourself, what you like, what you don't, just gives you more options, right? I saw
I
you
just
really,
looked it up. A
yes.
tuba player is either a tubist or a tubaist.
Oh, I like tubist very much. I think that's now I mean, it makes sense because it's a flautist, right? If you play the flute.
Hmm.
I love it. Okay, so for example, like a framework that I use to help with decision fatigue is art parts. And the art parts idea, the concept is that if you're making mixed media collage work, you make kind of backgrounds, embellishments, um, shapes, et cetera, separately. So you're not really thinking of finished compositions. But then when it's time to come together to make the art, everything is just easier and faster because just like mise en place for a chef, where you already have everything cut up, measured out, all you have to do is kind of you can experiment to see what looks great without the labor of having to make it in any way. You can play with design because you're not like, ugh, now I have to go find a piece of paper that's this, or I have to make something that's going to match better because you now have at your fingertips this stash of stuff that you can use. You have a structured way to come in and play with design. So that's why that one works for me. Um, and actually, I think it's true in like cooking shows. When you watch somebody in a kitchen and they're just like throwing the ingredients together because they're not chopping, they're not measuring, it is so much easier. You know, they're not having to clean along the way. All those things on the TV version of it makes it look very, very easy. And so the question is, how can you create a framework that makes your life a little bit easier? And the answer is almost always by doing a little bit of prep work in different ways so that when you go to do the final, put together things, it's easier. And the prep work can look like making your art parts, but the prep work could also be like studying color theory, studying design principles, figuring out a framework that works for yourself. All of that is the work that enables the other work.
Can you talk a little about people who design on the computer,
Mhm.
which is a little bit different, uh, but I feel like it maybe makes you prepare in a different way.
It's
But I
interesting.
don't
So
know because
I
I'm
went
not
I
the
went
one.
to a lecture by Milton Glaser, who is or I guess he's died now, who was a very, very famous graphic designer. He's the guy who made the Love, which the famous like New York, it's an L and an O on top and the V and the E underneath, and the O is kind of tilted. And he's done a lot of design work. I think he designed the New Yorker logo. I could be wrong, but he's done a ton and ton, a ton of famous design. And one of the things he said in the lecture is he said he tells all graphic design students who are designing on the computer that they need to get out and draw. Because even if they're not going to be drawing their designs by hand and they're doing it all on computer, he said you never really see something until you draw it, which is so true. And he said, it's so easy to alter a photo or do whatever, but you don't do the things that makes design interesting, which is simplifying something to its absolute essence, unless you understand its absolute essence, which you can't possibly understand until you've drawn it, because that's when you have to capture oh, I didn't see that little indent or that mark, or this thing changes slightly here, or the angle is different. And I have found for myself that it is true that in drawing something, you just understand it differently. Or I would even say I've been doing a series of Monet puzzles that I got for Christmas. I love puzzles. These are some of the hardest puzzles I have ever done in my entire life. And I feel like I have learned more about Monet's painting technique from doing these puzzles than I have ever done from taking a class, reading a book, going and seeing the paintings, standing in front of like Monet's beautiful work, in Paris or any of that stuff, because I've had to spend so much time studying, examining, making differences between different textures, brushstroke directions, small variations in color, like insane level details that I would never, ever, ever have paid attention to. And so I think drawing is a way of paying attention that you can't get, I think, somehow through the computer. And it is one of the reasons that I think also seeing artwork in person as opposed to online is so different, because you can't really pay attention to it somehow in the same way through the computer. That's probably not at all what you wanted me to talk about, but there you go.
No, but I was just wondering, I think each new tool, creates new opportunities
Mhm.
and new ways of figuring out how you want to work.
It does. And like I can tell you, I design my stencils on the computer. And one of the things that I always find interesting is there's very often a stencil that I love the design of that does not function the way that I would like it to, want it to, and it's a real clunker. And it's also it works the other way too. There can be a stencil that you look at it and you're like, eh, and then you use it and you think, so this is love. And you just, everything about it is perfect. And I had a talk once with Jamie, who's the owner of the Crafters Workshop, who makes my stencils. And she said, that one of the issues is the stencil has to have, I was arguing for a stencil that I loved, that I knew was super functional, and she was like, it doesn't have hanger appeal. The way that it works is these hang, and there's something that covers the top 2 inches of the stencil. And so the bottom, rest of the stencil has to be sexy enough that someone wants to buy it without necessarily thinking about function. And it was this whole thing that blew my mind, that in the commerce of selling stencils, you're not necessarily looking for things that are actually going to be super functional, but you're looking for things that people want to buy, which I get. We need to make money. It totally makes sense. But it is just a reminder that the way that design looks on the computer doesn't always translate to the way the design functions in real life. And that's probably true across a lot of things, I would guess, you know? It's the reason to make prototypes. And this happens to me a lot with Scan and Cut. So every month I do Scan and Cut project, and it often involves prototyping. And so I'll have an idea in my head of how it's going to look. And sometimes I am shocked it comes together immediately, perfectly. And I think, oh, I'm so talented. And then there are times when I am 4 prototypes in, 5 prototypes in, and I start to go, this was a terrible idea and I will never do this again. Or it's like, should I give up? Should I just try something else, or should I keep going until this works? And I think it's so interesting how things change in the real world. Okay, we got really lost on a rabbit hole there. The
I'm
point
back.
is frameworks replace doubt with a structured way to make confident artistic decisions. Okay, so let's get to number 4. They turn artistic growth into a repeatable, intentional process. So growth in art isn't random. It comes from consistent practice, reflection, and refinement. If I told you that there were ways to get better at soccer, you would be like, duh, yes. And if I told you just kicking a ball around for by yourself probably is not going to make you like a super soccer star unless you have some goals, some skills you're trying to build, you know what I mean? You'd say absolutely. So I don't know why art would be any different, right? You need to want to develop skills systematically rather than relying on occasional bursts of inspiration or something magical randomly happening to you, okay? So a framework can create a system for growth, so progress isn't left to chance. It can help you track your improvement over time, which feels good, keeps you motivated, keeps you going. And a framework encourages iteration so that each piece builds on what you learned before. So as an example, so in my art practice, the whole framework is really encouraging you to show up consistently, experiment regularly, engage with a creative community, and shows you how that simple process can compound into noticeable artistic improvement, right? The card designer workbook that I talked about earlier ensures that instead of making like one-off designs, right, you're going through a structured process of idea refinement leading to a more cohesive body of work. It's all of these structures, the P structure that I talked about. All of these frameworks are about saying, set a goal, hit that goal, keep rolling. And the goal isn't, I'm going to become Van Gogh. The goal is like, I'm going to make 3 marks on this piece of paper. I'm going to turn these 3 marks into a flower. I'm going to turn it into a bouquet of flowers. I'm going to cut off the left side of it, not your left ear, but the left side of the, paper. All of that, it's a framework. You're rolling from one decision to the next. So a framework turns art making into consistent, intentional journey leading to faster and more meaningful growth. So now that Mom and I have convinced you that frameworks are the best thing that ever happened and that you need a framework, let's talk about the key characteristics of a framework in art so that you can create some frameworks for yourself to work, right? So I'm going to use the rule of thirds as an example. And I am now on a podcast, which is not visual, going to tell you what this visual rule of thirds is. So here you go. The rule of thirds is a composition guideline. And if you can imagine a piece of paper, okay, you're going to divide it into 9 equal squares or rectangles, whichever way you think about it. So that's 2 lines that come down from the top to the bottom and 2 lines that go across from left to right or right to left so that you have a grid, essentially, of 9, okay? Now, where the 2 vertical and the 2 horizontal lines intersect, there are 4 points. Those 4 points, right, is the ideal place to place focal elements to create balance, visual interest, dynamic tension, like all that stuff that you want. And it really helps artists avoid placing subjects directly in the center, and it leads to, really nice compositions. So the entire framework in the rule of thirds is divide your canvas, whatever you're taking a photo of, or your art journal page, just divide it into those 9 parts. Place whatever your focal images, are at the points where the lines intersect or along the lines where they come around. Now, that's it. That's the entire framework. It is structured but flexible, right? Meaning it provides a process without restricting your creativity. It doesn't say it has to be right here. It says these are generally the good points. It gives you options. It's a problem-solving tool. So oftentimes if I'm stuck on my work and I don't like what's happening, I'll put a grid on top of it with a piece of chalk so that I can look at it. It helps me to analyze, refine, and improve the work. So I'm placing things where I need to. It's repeatable. I can apply it to a 4x6 piece of art or a, 75-foot long canvas, right? Because those lines can be any length. It supports growth, meaning that it encourages me to learn, to experiment, to build my skills, all those kinds of things, because it's such an easy framework to understand and experiment within. And then it builds confidence because I don't have to think about where should I put my focal image? What should I do? Because it reduces the uncertainty by offering me clear guidance and instruction. Some other famous art frameworks that you've probably heard of are the elements and principles of art, which we talked about, the Gestalt principles, which is all about how we perceive visual information and why certain designs feel harmonious. It's the idea that if like you put 75 dots all together in the shape of a pear, people see a pear instead of 75 dots. Color theory, which we've talked about, all of these are very famous frameworks that have been used throughout art to help people make what they want. Even things like the Zorn palette, which is an extremely limited palette of colors. That's something that's a framework for making art. You can make an amazing amount of art from these like very few colors. So how do you choose the right framework for your art practice? Mom, thanks for asking such good questions.
Get on it.
Um, so not all frameworks work for every artist because we're not all the same, and that's the beauty of it, right? So choosing the right framework depends on your current goals, your current challenges, and what is your artistic process. So here's how to find one that fits the needs. And I will have a little download in the show notes for this podcast where you can kind of like follow the path to see which one suits you. So different frameworks are designed to help with different aspects of creativity. So start by asking yourself, do I struggle with getting started? For example, then you might look for a framework that provides prompts or structures, right? Find out what your struggle is, right? Do I want to improve my technical skills? Well, then choose a framework focused on fundamentals and practice. Do I feel stuck in a creative rut? Pick a framework that encourages experimentation and play. Do I need help refining my work? Use a framework that helps with analysis and critique. Do I want to build a sustainable art practice? Find one that focuses on routine and consistency. So, whatever your problem is, you're looking for a framework that helps you with that problem. It's the same as I have so much stuff on my bathroom counter. Well, you can find a framework that helps you either de-stash, like throw away stuff, or you can find a shelf that helps create a framework for your stash of bathroom stuff that's all over your bathroom counter, right? If you have a problem, find a way to solve it with a framework.
That just made me think of the Container Store, which is in its entirety a series of frameworks.
It is, like they talk about, for instance, their alpha shelving solutions, and they have found over and over if it works in your closet, maybe it'll work in your kitchen. If it works in your kitchen, maybe you like it in your pantry. If it works in your, because it's a framework you understand. I can hang shelves and I can do this and I can put things here. And organizers almost always give you some kind of framework for how to store stuff so that it's easier to find. Okay, the second thing when finding the right framework, this is like speed dating for frameworks. Match the framework to your artistic goals. So this really is about thinking about where you want to go in your artistic journey, right? Because different frameworks support different creative ambitions. Some of us, I just read it actually this morning, a letter to, gosh, was it Dear Abby? It was Dear somebody. And it was this woman who makes crafts, and her friends are always trying to get her to sell them. And she doesn't want to. It's a hobby just for her. She has no interest in doing it. It takes forever to do. Nobody would pay the amount that she would need to justify the amount of time that it takes, all that kind of stuff, right? And so she was saying, like, how do I convince my friends that this is just something I enjoy? And I do think it's funny that I've used this metaphor before, but it's so true. If you're a runner, no one is ever like, you should get paid for that. You would totally, somebody would totally pay you 25 cents for every mile you run. That would be amazing. But if you make like crochet, anything, people are like, you should sell that. People would definitely buy it for less than the yarn is worth, 100%. And it just goes on and on like that, which I never understand. You can be a hobby runner and you can pay for expensive running shoes, running classes, go to a running group, spend hours of your life running, eat food that's specific to your running hobby, and everybody's like, good for you, good for you. But if you do that with your art, people are like, seems like a waste of money and time. What are you doing? And I never get it. So maybe you're a hobby artist, but you just want to get better, feel better, make better, whatever that is. Or maybe you have aspirations to be the next Frida Kahlo, Georgia O'Keeffe, whoever it is. So if you want to improve your foundational art skills, you want to think about how can you do that? How can you maybe learn the elements and principles of art to help you master composition, color, and design? Do you want to develop a creative habit? Do you want to push your creativity in new directions? What do you need to get where you want to go? Okay. And then the third thing to consider is to consider your artistic personality and process. So I recently joined a gym, which like I'm amazed that pigs aren't flying. But anyway,
Yeah.
uh, what I was going to say about that is that as part of it, you get a free like evaluation with a trainer. And when they were trying to match me with a trainer, one of the things that I said is I am not going to respond well to anybody who has a boot camp vibe. I know that works for some people, but the second somebody starts to yell at me or tell me something in a way that is authoritarian, I will turn around and walk out. Like it will just not happen. And I said, on the other end of the scale, if somebody starts to talk about like aligning chakras and, you know, getting in touch with your heart or something, I mean, like, I appreciate that just as I appreciate the boot camp thing, but I can't do it because my eyes roll into the back of the head. I was like, this is a Goldilocks moment where I need somebody in the middle, you know? And that is about knowing my personality. It's not about saying what's right for other people. I'm glad that there's a boot camp person for the people who need that. I'm glad that there's someone who wants to talk about emotional needs while doing, you know, physical exercise. I know there's somebody who needs that. I just don't. And so that's why you need to consider your own artistic personality and process. Do you enjoy structure and step-by-step learning? Do you prefer freedom but need occasional direction? Do you like deep diving into specific elements? Are you going to like geek out on something and get into the super nitty-gritty of it? You know, or do you just want like a surface level kind of general knowledge of things? Do you need accountability to stay consistent? This is kind of like, are you a group fitness person? Or can you do it in your house? Do you need a walking buddy? Or are you totally able to make it happen by yourself? These are all important questions, right? If you're self-directed, you might like working through the 100-day project. But if you need accountability, you might need to sign up for something that offers you that or find someone local who can help you. And I would say like even in my art practice, we have optional accountability groups for this because some people want them and some people are like, no, I'll do it on my own. I'm not interested. Okay, number 4. This will come as no surprise to you when I say that you need to test and adapt your framework because your needs are probably going to change over time, right? You don't have to stick with one framework forever. So try one for a month or two, you know, and then assess. And I think the 3 questions that are really important to ask yourself about any framework are, is it helping me stay motivated and productive? Do I feel like I'm improving? And am I enjoying the process? Please don't forget about number 3. I don't believe that we will do almost anything that we're not enjoying. This is why people talk about exercise endorphins, right? Because it means that at some point they enjoy the exercise. I would hope that anything that you do, you try to find the joy in it, right? So we need to make sure that, yes, all that other stuff is happening, but that you're also enjoying it. Now, if a framework isn't quite working, tweak it. Many artists, myself included, use a combination of frameworks at different stages and in different places. So, like, I often will start with the elements and principles of art, and then I might move through into some idea iteration through like the Carve December workbook process. And then I might make some art parts. And then I might, you know, go through the P, practice, experiment, embrace. Then I might, who knows, you know, if the moon is up and Jupiter's and Venus or whatever, who knows how things might go. Okay. So, final thoughts. Here it is in a nutshell. You just listened to a long podcast, and I'm going to give you the secret right here at the end. The best framework is the one that you'll use. And that's the truth. You know, the healthiest food is the one that you'll actually eat. So at the end of the day, the best framework is the one that fits your creative style and helps you make progress. So start with the one that excites you. You know, try it, adjust as needed. If you're looking for them, you can literally type into Google artistic framework and all sorts of stuff will come up. Okay. Your artistic journey is unique and the right framework will support, not limit your creativity. Okay, Mom, I know that you are coughing so that I'm not supposed to ask you questions right now. But do you have any words of wisdom and thoughts about frameworks after I've dragged you through my little framework boot camp here?
No, I really enjoyed this. I have to say, I was thinking the whole time of various limitations that I've gone through in life that have actually led me to find new ways of thinking about something. Can range from the time I broke my hand and I had a long cast on my entire forearm up from my fingers, which meant I had to dress myself, either cut off one sleeve of everything I put on, or it was like one sweater that I could wear that would fit over the cast. And for 6 weeks, I wore this one sweater and with other things. I mean, that was a limitation, and I started looking at my clothes differently. Or that there is the idea that, so I had my first child who
Mhm.
happened to bear a resemblance to you, and there are limitations when you have a
Mhm.
little baby and you have a little toddler and so on, and you either going to find a way to make that life work for you,
Mhm.
or you're going to be really unhappy.
Mhm.
But through finding ways to make that life work for me, I discovered things. That's when I started aerobics. That's when I, just started all kinds of things that I hadn't done before, and met people that I wouldn't have met before.
Mhm.
And I just think that it adds to the richness of your life to recognize when something has changed, and then to figure out, how can I use this for some growth in some area. It's a constant life thing.
Mhm.
And people who are resistant to change, I think it's the work that it takes to make it fit into your life that sometimes they're not liking. It's a very interesting topic, frameworks, because you actually do it all the time in your life.
You do, and a lot of times it's unconscious. And I think one of the biggest points here is to think about, if you make something conscious, the benefit of it is that you're able to use it more thoughtfully to push yourself forward, right? That's the reason to be conscious of what it is that you're doing. So I think what I would say to our listeners and our viewers is, what is a framework that you have already used in your art? I'm sure there's something. Oftentimes teachers will give you like a set of instructions or something like that. So if you've ever taken a class, you probably have a framework, but haven't thought about it in that language. Or maybe there's a framework you've resisted, like you've heard about color theory and you're like, I use colors how I want, or you've heard about elements and principles of design and you've been like, that seems like a lot of work. You know, are there things out there that you're sort of aware of, but you've decided against for whatever reason? I would encourage you, whether it's a small framework or a big one. I think a lot of YouTube videos are also frameworks without people saying that, because they'll have titles like The Secret to Making Great Art or 5 Steps You Can Take to Make Your Mixed Media Art More Interesting. All of those things are basically frameworks. Okay. For a closing example, I will say that recently, one of the members of my art practice mentioned that a teacher had told her to always put black in her work. And I said, oh, that's really interesting. So that's a framework for her. Always add black to her work. And I said, but do you know why? Because I think that once you know the why, then you can mess around with the framework a little bit. And she said basically that she didn't. And I said, it's because most people don't work in dark value, meaning value light to dark. And so what it does is it creates contrast and interest in your work by adding that black, because probably what you mostly have are lights and midtones. So, because that's what everybody does. That's like a natural way of working. And so that is just a quick, easy way to spark something up. There was a period of time when unknowingly I understood there was something about putting black splatters on everything that would make the work look better. I couldn't have told you what it was. I just understood that I had to do these black splatters. So there's a whole period of work just that has black splatters all over it. But now I understand it's because I need that dark value in it. And understanding that part of the framework means that I can be more sophisticated about the ways in which I add dark or think about how I'm sparking up my composition. Okay. So this is a new feature that I told mom about that we're going to
Oh,
try to end
God.
every podcast with. She's groaning already. She's so excited when I have these new ideas. So the new feature, because I'm trying to live a more joyful life and think of joy every single day. So the new feature is just talking about a moment of joy that we recently had. So I'll go first, Mom, because I can see your
Thank
faces.
God.
Because I can see your face is grumpy. So my 5-year-old is awesome. And I know everybody says that, but he is a future theater kid if I ever saw one. He went to school today for picture day, dressed head to toe in a policeman outfit because he insisted it is absolutely what he wanted to wear in his school picture. He went to school on Friday dressed in an owlette costume, who is a character from PJ Masks, if you don't know that, because he said it felt like a flying kind of day. I'm so glad that he has confidence and swagger and loves being himself and loves playing dress up and feels great about, playing different characters and all this kind of stuff. He is a joyful little person, and I was catapulted into joy this morning seeing his delight in saying, "I'm a police officer" to everyone that we saw on our walk to school. Mom, what's your moment of joy?
You just stole it. Okay, I'll do a different one, and it has to do with him and the most amazing things that he says
Mhm.
that startle me, uh, because I don't know where they're coming from, and it reinforces in me realizing that he's a separate person with a whole different world. So you asked him a question the other day, which was, does he believe dreams come true? And he said yes. And then I think you asked him to give an example. And he said that there was a day when he dreamed about dragons, and then the whole day he was a dragon. You just didn't see it, but he was actually a dragon the whole day. And I just thought that's pretty wonderful.
Mhm.
That is pretty wonderful. And then another day recently, he had watched a movie with us called Flow. It's an Academy Award winning movie, and it involved a flood. And he said it was asking you questions about water. And he said, can water destroy anything? And you said, over time, yes. And he said, but water can't destroy love. And then he followed that up with, but it can, but it can
Break
make you
your
sick,
heart.
break your heart. And I just thought to myself, it's a poem. I mean, this is a person whom I think of as, you know, having a tantrum about something. Uh,
Well, to be fair, he is a person who has a tantrum about
but
something.
in his head, lots
Yes.
of interesting things are happening, and I need to suck it all out because I need that. I'm so excited when he says something like that.
It is true that children teach us joy. And by the way, so much of childhood parenting, especially early childhood parenting, is giving children frameworks. This is the framework of how we go to bed or how we behave in public or how we behave in a restaurant or what we do, here or there. We took them to a play for the first time, and we said this is how you behave in a play, and this the people are going to be live and you have to be quiet, and all of that again is a framework that's to help him understand how to behave. And so I think frameworks are all around us, you guys. They really are. And so is joy. Okay, so if you want to connect, you can find me at juliebalzer.com or all over social media as at Balzer Designs. Please sign up for the free weekly newsletter. That's the best way to make sure you keep up on the latest news. There's a big button on the homepage of juliebalzer.com where you can do that, or you can go to the show page for this podcast to find the link. And if you'd like to help the show, and I always appreciate it when you guys do this, so thank you so much, you can leave a review. You can mention us on social media. You can tell a friend about the podcast, because all of those things help other people find the show. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can give us a thumbs up. You can leave a comment. You can subscribe to the channel. Again, all of that stuff helps the show grow. So thank you so much for listening and subscribing. And we'll see you the next time on the Adventures in Arting podcast.
I